The next few days were a study in small observations. I didn't change anything about how I moved through the hotel. I didn't alter my routine, didn't adjust my visibility, didn't give Vivian Castillo or anyone connected to her any reason to believe I was watching. That was important because watching only works if no one knows it's happening. So I stayed in my rhythm. Morning coffee in the kitchen with the staff, a walkthrough of the property before 10, paperwork until noon, lunch in my office, afternoons spent wherever the hotel needed me most. It looked the same as any other week. But underneath, I was cataloging. The suite upgrade request came back flagged by my operations manager within the hour. The honeymoon suite was booked. A corporate retreat had reserved it weeks earlier, well before the Hale wedding deposit was placed. There was no available upgrade that matched what Vivian had requested. I handled it myself. I called her directly, explained the situation with the same measured tone I use for every guest, and offered 2 alternatives that were, frankly, beautiful rooms. Rooms that most people would have been grateful for. Vivian's response was silence. A long, deliberate silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that isn't confusion, it's calculation. "I'll speak to Marcus about it," she said, and hung up. She didn't say goodbye. It wasn't rude, exactly. It was something more precise than that. It was a signal. A small, intentional one, meant to let me know that this conversation wasn't finished, that I had said no to something, and that saying no was going to have a cost. I set the phone down and wrote nothing in my notes. Some things don't need to be recorded. Some things you just carry in the back of your mind, quietly, like a second heartbeat. Marcus arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I wasn't in the lobby when he walked in. I was in the kitchen, reviewing the menu with our chef, and Claire texted me a single line, "He's here. Checking in now. Diane is handling it." I read the message, put my phone in my pocket, and finished my conversation about the dessert course. There was no reason to rush. There was no reason to be anywhere near the front desk. Marcus Hale was a guest. I was the owner. The distance between those two things was exactly where I needed to stay for now. But I did walk through the lobby later that evening, casually, the way I do every night before I leave. And I saw him. He looked the same. That was the first thing I noticed, and it surprised me, not because I expected him to look different, but because I expected to feel different looking at him. I expected some residual pull, some ghost of the person I had once been in love with. But there was nothing. He was standing by the elevator with Vivian, holding a drink, talking to someone I didn't recognize, a man in a well-cut suit who laughed too loudly at something Marcus said. Marcus glanced toward the lobby entrance as I passed. Our eyes met for 1 second. Maybe less. He didn't recognize me. Or he did, and he chose not to show it. Either way, the effect was the same. I was invisible to him. And in that moment, standing in my own hotel, in the space I had built with my own hands, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not hurt. Not anger. Something colder than both. A kind of confirmation. So that's how this is going to go. I kept walking. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. The wedding preparations accelerated over the next week, and with them, so did the small incidents. They came one at a time, spaced just far enough apart that each one could be dismissed on its own. But I wasn't dismissing them. I was collecting them. The first one happened on a Friday morning. Claire came to me with a look I had learned to read over 4 years of working together, not alarm, but a careful kind of irritation. "Vivian called the florist directly," she said. "Bypassed our events coordinator entirely. Told them to change the centerpiece flowers and charge it to the hotel's account." "Our account?" "Our account." I looked at Claire for a moment. Did she have authorization to do that? No. She has authorization to request changes through our events team. Direct billing goes through me, and I didn't approve it. Then we reverse the charge and route it back to her deposit. Standard process. Claire nodded. She started to leave, then stopped. Elena, she's going to push back on this. I know, I said. Let her. Claire left, and I made a note. Not on paper in my mind, in the quiet, organized space where I keep track of things that matter. One incident. Small. Easily explained away. A misunderstanding, maybe. An overeager bride who didn't understand the process. I gave her the benefit of the doubt, the way I would for any guest. But I kept the note. The second incident came 2 days later, and it was less easy to dismiss. One of my staff members, a young woman named Lena, who worked the front desk on weekday mornings, came to me after her shift looking unsettled. She sat in the small office and folded her hands in her lap the way people do when they're trying to decide how much to say. Ms. Ward, she started, and then stopped. Take your time, I said. She looked up. Vivian Castillo came to the desk this morning. She wanted to know the Wi-Fi password for a private network, the kind we set up for corporate events. I told her that was only available for authorized event contacts, and that she'd need to submit a request through our events team. Okay. She didn't like that. Lena paused. She said, and I'm trying to remember exactly what she said, I'm marrying into one of the most connected families in this city. You do well to remember who you're talking to. And then she looked at me like. Lena trailed off, her jaw tightening slightly. Like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. I watched Lena's face as she said it. I watched the way her shoulders had pulled inward, the way her voice had dropped, not from shame, but from the effort of holding herself together after being made to feel small. I had seen that look before. I had worn it myself, years ago, in rooms where I wasn't valued. And I knew, with absolute clarity, what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that kind of casual cruelty. Thank you for telling me, I said. You did exactly the right thing by following the process. I want you to know that. Lena nodded, and some of the tension left her shoulders. She left the office, and I sat alone with the quiet fury that had begun to build somewhere beneath my ribs, not the loud kind, not the kind that demands an immediate response. The quiet kind. The kind that sharpens, slowly, into something precise. I picked up the phone and called Claire. I want a full audit of every interaction Vivian Castillo has had with our staff since the booking was confirmed, I said. Every request. Every conversation. Everything. There was a brief pause on Claire's end. She understood what that meant. I'll have it for you by the end of day. Thank you. I hung up and sat back in my chair, and for the first time since I had seen Marcus Hale's name on that reservation form, I allowed myself to think not about the past, not about what he had done or what I had lost, but about the present. About what was happening, right now, in the space I had built. About the way someone was moving through my hotel like it belonged to them, and the way the people who worked for me were paying the price for it. The audit arrived at 4 in the afternoon, and it was worse than I expected. Claire laid it out for me in her usual clean, methodical way, a timeline of interactions, each one documented with the name of the staff member involved, the nature of the request, and the outcome. 7 interactions in 11 days. In 4 of them, Vivian had made requests that fell outside the scope of what a wedding guest was authorized to do. In 2 of them, she had spoken to staff in a way that Claire described, carefully, as dismissive. In one of them, the Wi-Fi incident with Lena, she had crossed a line that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with how she chose to treat people. I read through the entire document twice. Then I closed it, set it on my desk, and looked out the window at the city for a long time. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an overeager bride adjusting to a new environment. This was a pattern. And patterns, in my experience, don't change on their own. They escalate. I thought about Marcus then, not with longing, not with bitterness, but with a strange, quiet curiosity. I wondered what he knew about the way Vivian treated people. I wondered if he had seen it, or if he had chosen not to. I wondered if he recognized the shape of it because I did. I recognized it the way you recognize a melody you heard once, years ago, in a room you never wanted to go back to. That evening, I stayed late at the hotel. I sat in my office after everyone had gone home, and I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my lawyer, a woman named Ruth Chen, who I had worked with since the early days of the ASHFORD, and who understood, without me having to explain, that when I called her in the evening, something was beginning. "Elena," she said. "What do we have?" "A pattern," I said. "Not enough yet. But it's there." "Then document everything," Ruth said. Quietly. "Don't confront anyone. Don't warn anyone. Just watch, and write it down." "That's exactly what I'm doing." "Good. Call me when the picture is complete." I hung up and made the second call to Claire. I told her I wanted a quiet, informal meeting with the events team in the morning. Nothing formal. Nothing that would raise eyebrows or suggest anything unusual. I just wanted everyone in the same room, aware of the situation, and clear on one thing. The rules of the ASHFORD applied to everyone, without exception. No one was above them. Not guests. Not families. Not anyone. Claire understood. She always did. I locked up the hotel that night alone, walking through the empty lobby with the lights dimmed and the city glowing softly outside the windows. ASHFORD was quiet. It was always quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that felt earned, that came from years of careful attention. I stood in the middle of the lobby for a moment, my hands in my pockets, and I listened to the silence. Something was coming. I could feel it the way you feel weather change, not through sight, but through something deeper. A shift in the air. A pressure behind the calm. I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready. The meeting with the events team happened the next morning, and it was exactly as unremarkable as I needed it to be. I kept it short. 15 minutes in the small conference room behind the kitchen, with coffee and no agenda printed on paper. I spoke casually, the way I do when I want people to absorb something without feeling like they're being given orders. I told them that the wedding season was picking up, that we had a high-profile event coming in, and that I wanted to make sure everyone felt supported and clear on how to handle any requests that fell outside normal channels. "If anyone asks you to do something that doesn't feel right," I said, "don't say yes, and don't say no. Just come to me or Claire first. That's all." A few nods. A few quiet acknowledgements. Diane, who had been on the front desk when Vivian first walked in demanding the suite upgrade, caught my eye for a moment. She didn't say anything, but I saw the recognition in her face, the relief of being told that her instincts were correct. That the thing she had felt in that interaction was real, and that someone with authority had noticed it. I thanked them, and they left. And the hotel continued its day as though nothing had changed. But something had. Quietly, invisibly, something had shifted. The staff knew, without being told explicitly, that I was paying attention. And that knowledge of simple, unspoken awareness changed the way they carried themselves. Not dramatically. Not in any way a guest would notice. But enough. Enough that when Vivian Castillo walked through the lobby that afternoon, the people she passed didn't shrink. They smiled. They were polite. But they didn't bend. It was a small thing. But small things, in my experience, are the only things that matter at the beginning. The weekend brought a shift in the energy of the hotel that I felt more than I saw. Marcus and Vivian had brought a group of friends, or what passed for friends in their world. Loud, well-dressed, confident in the way that people are confident when they have never been told no by anyone who mattered. They filled the lounge on Saturday evening, ordered expensive drinks, and spoke at a volume that suggested they had never considered the possibility that a space might belong to someone else. I watched them from the doorway of my office, not with judgment exactly, but with the careful attention of someone cataloging behavior. One of them, a man I would later learn was named Derek, a business associate of Marcus, spent the better part of the evening holding court at the bar, telling stories that grew louder and more self-congratulatory with every drink. At one point, he called out to the bartender, a quiet, experienced man named James who had been with the ASHFORD since before I owned it, and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "Hey, does this place actually have good bourbon, or are we just paying for the wallpaper?" A few of the group laughed. James smiled, the way he always did when someone tested him, and poured a measure of Blanton's without comment. He set it down in front of Derek with the same steady hand he used for every guest, and Derek took it without a thank you. I watched James's face. It was calm. Practiced. But I knew him well enough to see the thing underneath the small, quiet cost of being spoken to that way, night after night, by people who saw him as furniture. I had seen it before, in other jobs, in other rooms. The way service works teaches you to absorb other people's carelessness without flinching. I made a note of it. Derek. The comment. The laughter. The absence of a thank you. Sunday was quieter, but only on the surface. Vivian came to the front desk in the late morning and asked, not requested, asked, in the way that someone asks a question they already know the answer to, whether the hotel's private terrace could be reserved exclusively for the wedding party for the remainder of their stay. The terrace was a shared space. It was available to all guests on a first-come basis, and it was, in fact, currently being used by a couple on their anniversary who had booked it through the proper channels weeks in advance. Diane handled it. She explained the policy clearly and kindly, the way I had trained her to, and offered to check availability for a private terrace reservation during times when it wasn't in use. Vivian's response was a slow, deliberate look, the kind of look that is designed to make someone feel small without saying a word. Then she said, very quietly, I find it hard to believe that a hotel of this caliber can't accommodate a simple request for one of its most important guests. Diane held her ground. She smiled, repeated the offer, and Vivian left without another word. Diane came to me an hour later, and this time she didn't look unsettled. She looked sharp. Focused. Like someone who had just passed a test she didn't know she was taking. She tried the same thing again, Diane said. I followed the process. She didn't like it, but she didn't push further. Good, I said. You did well. Diane nodded, and I saw something in her expression that I recognized, the beginning of a different kind of confidence. Not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind that comes from knowing you stood where you were supposed to stand, and you didn't move. It was the same kind of confidence I had spent years building in myself. And watching it form in someone else was, in its own way, more satisfying than anything I had felt in a long time. By Monday, I had a clearer picture. The pattern was no longer subtle. Over the course of 10 days, Vivian Castillo had made 14 requests that fell outside the scope of her authorization as a wedding guest. 6 of those requests had involved direct contact with staff, bypassing our events team entirely. 3 had involved attempts to charge expenses to the ASHFORD's account without approval. And in 4 separate interactions, she had spoken to members of my staff in a way that was not just dismissive, it was calculated. Each comment was small enough to deny if called out. Each one landed precisely where it was designed to land. I had seen this before. Not from Vivian, specifically from people like her. People who understood, instinctively, how to make others feel like the rules were beneath them. Like compliance was a sign of weakness, and authority was something you claimed rather than earned. The difference, this time, was that I was the authority. And I knew exactly what I was looking at. I called Ruth Chen on Monday evening. Tell me where we are, she said, without preamble. Ruth didn't waste words. It was one of the reasons I trusted her. 14 incidents in 10 days, I said. Staff interactions documented. 2 charges reversed. 1 direct policy violation, the terrace request. Everything is clean. Everything is on record. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Has she done anything that breaches the guest contract? Not technically. She's been careful. Every request has been phrased as a question or a suggestion. Nothing on paper that she couldn't defend as a misunderstanding. But the pattern is clear. And the way she's treating my staff is becoming a liability issue. If this continues through the wedding, we're looking at a formal complaint from at least 2 employees. Then you have 2 options, Ruth said. You wait for a clear breach, something unambiguous, something that gives you grounds to act, or you address it now, quietly, through a private conversation with the groom. I thought about that for a moment. Marcus. The idea of sitting across from him, having a calm, professional conversation about his fiancé's behavior felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Not because it would be difficult. Because it would be pointless. I knew Marcus well enough to understand that a quiet conversation about someone else's behavior was not something he responded to. He responded to pressure. To consequences. To the kind of force that made ignoring the problem more uncomfortable than addressing it. I'll wait, I said. For the breach. Be patient, Ruth said. But don't wait too long. I won't. I hung up, and I sat with the weight of the decision for a long time that night. Not because I was uncertain. I wasn't. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I knew exactly why. But there was something underneath the strategy, something quieter, more personal that I needed to sit with before I could move forward. It was this: I was angry. Not the loud, hot kind of anger that demands to be heard. The other kind. The deep, slow kind that settles into your bones and doesn't leave. The kind that comes from watching someone you care about, your staff, your hotel, the thing you built, being treated like it doesn't matter. Like it's just a backdrop for someone else's story. And the kind that comes, too, from recognizing something familiar in the way Vivian moved through the world, something I had seen before, in the way Marcus had once moved through mine. I hadn't connected those 2 things until now. Until I was sitting in my office at 11 o'clock on a Monday night, looking at a timeline of small cruelties, and understanding with a clarity that felt almost like cold water that the woman Marcus had chosen to marry was not an accident. She was a pattern. And I had been part of it, once, without knowing it. That realization didn't make me sad. It made me very, very still. The next day, Tuesday, was the day everything changed. I had spent the morning in the kitchen, going over the wedding menu with the chef, when Claire appeared in the doorway with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not alarm. Not irritation. Something closer to disbelief. "Elena," she said. "You need to come see this." I followed her to the events room, a sleek, airy space on the ground floor where we coordinate large bookings. On the long table in the center of the room, spread out like a crime scene, were documents. Printed emails. Invoices. A contract not ours, but one that Vivian had apparently drafted herself that authorized a series of changes to the wedding setup, changes that would have restructured the entire event timeline and reassigned several of our vendor contracts to outside parties. I picked up the contract and read it slowly, carefully, the way Ruth had taught me to read anything that mattered. It was well written. Precise. Someone with legal knowledge had helped draft it, or Vivian herself was more sophisticated than I had given her credit for. The language was designed to make the changes look like standard event modifications. To someone glancing at it quickly, it might have passed. But to someone reading closely, to someone who knew the ASHFORD's contracts the way I knew them, it was unmistakable. It was an attempt to take control of the event from the inside. I set the document down. I looked at Claire. "Where did this come from?" "One of the vendors called. They received this directly from Vivian, with instructions to proceed. No copy to us. No approval from the events team." Claire paused. "She's been doing this for days, Elena. This is just the one that got caught." I stood very still for a long moment. The kitchen noise drifted in from down the hall, the clatter of prep, the quiet hum of a radio. The hotel was alive around me, the way it always was, and I was standing at the center of it, holding a piece of paper that had just told me something I had been waiting to hear. The breach. I looked at Claire, and I said, very quietly, call Ruth. Ruth Chen arrived at the Ashford at 2 o'clock that afternoon, and she walked in the way she always did. Quietly, without announcement, like someone who had spent decades learning that the less noise you make entering a room, the more authority you carry when you finally speak. I met her in my office. I had the documents laid out on Vivian's unauthorized contract, the audit Claire had compiled, the timeline of incidents, the reverse charges, the staff interaction reports. Everything. 2 weeks of careful, quiet observation, organized into a folder that told a single, undeniable story. Ruth sat down, put on her glasses, and read. She didn't speak for 15 minutes. I didn't interrupt her. I sat across the desk with my hands folded and waited, the way I had learned to wait over years of building something that required patience more than speed. When she finally looked up, her expression was calm. Measured. But there was something underneath it, a kind of professional satisfaction that Ruth never showed openly, but that I had learned to recognize. This is clean, she said. I know. The unauthorized contract alone gives you grounds for immediate action. The pattern of staff interaction strengthens it. The reverse charges create a financial record. She set the folder down and leaned back. Elena, she handed you everything you need. I know that too. Ruth studied me for a moment. So why do you look like you're still thinking? I was quiet for a beat. Then I said, because I want to do this right. Not fast. Right. Ruth nodded slowly. She understood the difference. In her world and the world of contracts and clauses and legal precedent, the difference between fast and right was the difference between winning and winning in a way that couldn't be challenged. And I wanted the latter. I wanted what happened next to be so clean, so procedurally airtight, that no one in that hotel, not Marcus, not Vivian, not Derek, or any of the loud, self-satisfied people who had filled my lobby over the past 2 weeks could look back and say I had acted out of spite or personal history. Because I hadn't. That was the thing I needed to be certain of, not just legally, but inside myself. This wasn't about Marcus. It wasn't about what he had done to me 2 years ago, or the empty account, or the email that had ended everything without the dignity of a conversation. This was about Vivian Castillo walking through my hotel and treating the people who worked there like they were invisible. This was about a contract being drafted in secret, designed to strip authority from the place I had built. This was about a pattern, a quiet, deliberate pattern of disrespect that had gone on long enough. Ruth outlined the steps. First, we would formally notify Vivian that the unauthorized contract was invalid and that any changes made outside of the ASHFORD's event management process would be reversed. Second, we would issue a formal notice of policy violation, not a threat, not a warning, just a statement of fact. This is what happened, this is what the contract says, this is what comes next. Third, if the behavior continued, we had grounds to terminate the wedding booking entirely, with full documentation to support the decision. Do you want to give her the chance to correct it? Ruth asked. I thought about that. I thought about Lena, sitting in my office with her shoulders pulled inward. I thought about James behind the bar, absorbing a stranger's carelessness with a practiced smile. I thought about Diane, holding her ground at the front desk while Vivian looked at her like she was something stuck to the bottom of a shoe. One chance, I said. One formal notice. If she responds the way I think she will, we will move to termination. Ruth nodded. I'll draft the notice tonight. She left, and I sat alone in my office as the afternoon light shifted across the desk. The folder of documents sat in front of me, neat, organized, devastating in its quietness. I looked at it for a long time, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not anger. Not anticipation. Something closer to resolve. The kind of resolve that doesn't announce itself. It just settles in, quietly, and stays. The formal notice was delivered the next morning. Claire handled it personally. She brought it to Vivian in the lobby, handed it over with the same calm, professional demeanor she brought to everything, and explained briefly, clearly what the notice contained and what it meant. Vivian took the document. She didn't open it in front of Claire. She didn't say anything. She just looked at Claire with an expression that was difficult to read, not anger, not surprise, but something more guarded. Something that suggested she was recalculating. Claire reported back to me within the hour. She didn't react the way I expected, Claire said. How did she react? She was quiet. Very quiet. She thanked me, which surprised me, and then she said she would review the notice and respond by the end of day. I nodded. And did she? Claire shook her head. Not yet. It's been 6 hours. I wasn't surprised. The silence was predictable. People like Vivian didn't respond to formal notices immediately, not because they needed time to understand them, but because they needed time to decide how to respond without revealing how much the notice had unsettled them. I told Claire to wait. To let the silence do its work. And I went back to running my hotel. It was Thursday evening when Marcus appeared at my office door. I was alone, going over the next week's staffing schedule, when I looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. Not Vivian. Marcus. He was wearing a dark jacket, no tie, and his hands were in his pockets in a way that suggested he had been standing there for a moment before I noticed him rehearsing something, maybe, or just waiting to see if I would look up on my own. I did. And I looked at him the way I looked at any guest who appeared at my door, openly, calmly, without urgency. Elena, he said. It was the first time he had used my name since he arrived. The first time he had acknowledged, directly, that he knew exactly who I was and had known since the moment he walked into this hotel. Marcus, I said. Can I help you with something? He stepped into the room. He didn't sit down. He stood in front of my desk with his hands still in his pockets, and for a moment he just looked at me, not the way he used to, not with the warmth or the easy confidence I remembered from 2 years ago. With something else. Something that looked, almost, like uncertainty. Vivian showed me the notice, he said. I see. She's upset. I tilted my head slightly. The notice outlined specific policy violations, Marcus. It's not personal. It's procedural. I know what it is. He shifted his weight. I'm asking you off the record if there's a way to resolve this quietly. Without making it a bigger thing than it needs to be. I studied him for a long moment. Off the record. Quietly. Without making it a bigger thing. The words were so familiar and so perfectly tuned to the frequency of someone who wanted a problem to disappear without actually doing the work of fixing it that I almost felt something. Almost. But the almost was brief, and what replaced it was something much steadier. Marcus, I said, and I kept my voice exactly where it was, calm, even, unhurried. The notice is clear. The violations are documented. Vivian has until the end of business tomorrow to respond formally. If she does, and if the response addresses the issues, we can discuss next steps. But I'm not going to have an off-the-record conversation about it. That's not how ASHFORD works. He stared at me. And for just a second, just a fraction of a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Not anger. Recognition. The look of a man who had just realized that the woman standing in front of him was not the woman he remembered. That something had changed, and he had no leverage over it. Understood, he said, quietly. And he left. I sat very still after he walked out. Not because the conversation had shaken me. It hadn't. But because of what it had confirmed, something I had suspected since the moment I saw his name on that reservation form, but hadn't allowed myself to fully articulate until now. Marcus Hale had come to this hotel expecting to be invisible. Expecting that his name, his presence, his history with me would carry no weight because in his mind, I carried no weight. I was someone he had left behind quietly, without consequence, and he had assumed the way people assume things when they have never been truly challenged, that I would stay that way. Small. Accommodating. Unseen. he was wrong. And the beautiful thing that made me sit in my chair with something that was not quite a smile but close to one was that he was only just beginning to understand how wrong he was. Friday passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The hotel operated as it always did. Guests checked in and out. The kitchen hummed. Claire moved through the day with her usual efficiency, and the staff carried themselves with a quiet steadiness that told me they knew, without being told, that something significant was happening beneath the surface. They didn't ask me about it. They didn't need to. They trusted me to handle it, the way they had trusted me with every difficult situation since the day I opened this hotel's doors. Vivian's response came at 4:47 in the afternoon, 13 minutes before the deadline. It was an email. 3 paragraphs. Formal, measured, and drafted clearly with legal help of her own. The tone was conciliatory. It acknowledged the violations in vague, non-specific language. It expressed Vivian's sincere regret for any confusion and her commitment to working within the ASHFORD's established processes going forward. It was, on the surface, exactly what a formal response to a policy notice should look like. But it was missing one thing. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Ruth with a single line: she didn't apologize to the staff. Ruth's reply came back in 4 minutes, then she didn't respond. I set my phone down and looked out the window at the city settling into the evening. The light was fading in that slow, golden way it does in late autumn, not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet, inevitable shift from one thing to the next. I thought about what came next. I thought about the wedding 4 days away now, the preparations in full swing, the vendors arriving, the flowers being arranged, the quiet machinery of celebration clicking into place around a union that I was no longer certain deserved to happen inside my walls. I thought about Lena. About James. About Diane and Claire, and every person who had walked through this hotel's doors believing it was a place where dignity was respected. And I thought about the contract on my desk, the one Ruth had already drafted, the one that was clean and precise and legally unassailable, the one that would end this. I picked up the phone and called Ruth. "We move forward," I said. "Tonight?" "Tonight. Prompt me for the final when ready." Final. The termination notice was signed at 9:14 that evening. I signed it alone, in my office, with the same steady hand I had used to sign the original booking approval weeks earlier. The symmetry of it was not lost on me, the same pen, the same desk, the same quiet room. But the feeling was entirely different. When I had approved the booking, there had been something uncertain underneath the comma question I hadn't yet answered, about who I was in relation to this situation and what I was willing to do about it. Now there was no question. There was only clarity. Only the clean, final movement of a pen across paper, and the knowledge that what I was signing would not be undone. Ruth had drafted the notice with the kind of precision that made it feel less like a legal document and more like a statement of fact. It outlined every violation, each one dated, each one documented, each one supported by the records Claire had kept. It referenced the unauthorized contract Vivian had drafted. It cited the formal notice and the inadequate response. And it stated, in language that left no room for interpretation, that the wedding booking at the ASHFORD was terminated, effective immediately, and that the deposit would be forfeited in accordance with the clause in the original contract that addressed material policy violations. I read it one final time before I signed. Not because I was uncertain. Because I wanted to be sure that every word was right. That every sentence earned its place. That when Marcus and Vivian read this document and they would read it, carefully, slowly, with the full weight of what it meant settling over them, there would be nothing in it that felt personal. Nothing that revealed the history between me and Marcus. Nothing that gave them a reason to say this was revenge, or bitterness, or the action of a woman who couldn't let go. It wasn't any of those things. And the document made that clear. I signed it, and it was done. Claire delivered the notice the next morning. Saturday. The day the final wedding preparations were supposed to begin in earnest, the day the flowers were scheduled to arrive, the day the caterers were set to walk through the venue, the day the small, intricate machinery of celebration was supposed to hum into its final, seamless motion. Instead, it stopped. Claire brought the notice to Marcus directly, not to Vivian. That was my decision, and I made it deliberately. Ruth had advised me that delivering it to the primary contractual contact, Marcus, whose name was on the booking, was the correct procedure. But there was something else underneath that decision, something quieter. I wanted Marcus to be the first one to hold it. I wanted him to be the one to read it, to understand it, to feel the weight of it before anyone else in that room did. Because he was the one who had walked into my hotel expecting invisibility. He was the one who had sat in my office the night before, asking for a quiet resolution, as though the problem were something small and manageable and beneath the attention of someone like him. I wanted him to understand that it wasn't. Claire told me afterward that the delivery took less than a minute. She handed Marcus the envelope in the lobby. He opened it there, standing by the elevator, the way he had been standing the first night I saw him, relaxed, unhurried, holding a drink he never finished. He read the first page. Then the second. Then he stopped reading and looked up at Claire with an expression she described, later, as very still. He didn't say anything for a long time, Claire told me. Then he asked if he could speak to the owner. "And what did you say?" "I said I would pass the message along." I smiled at that, a real smile, small and private, the kind I don't often let anyone see. Because Claire knew, without being told, that passing the message along was not the same as granting the meeting. It was a door that stayed closed, politely, firmly, without explanation. Marcus did not get his meeting. What happened next unfolded over the course of that Saturday with a quietness that felt almost theatrical in its restraint, as though the situation had decided, on its own, to resolve itself with the same calm that I had brought to every step of the process. The vendors were notified first. Claire handled it personally, a series of brief, professional calls explaining that the wedding booking had been terminated and that their contracts with the ASHFORD remained intact, but that any work done under Vivian's direct authorization, the unauthorized changes, the reassigned vendors, the alterations to the event timeline, would not be honored or paid for. The vendors, for the most part, were relieved. Two of them told Claire, quietly, that they had been uncomfortable with Vivian's direct instructions and had only complied because they assumed the hotel had sanctioned them. They hadn't. And now everyone knows it. Vivian arrived in the lobby at 11 o'clock. I was not there when she walked in. I was in the kitchen, having coffee with James, talking about nothing in particular, the weather, a new recipe he wanted to try, the way the light looked through the kitchen windows in the morning. I was there deliberately. I wanted to be somewhere calm, somewhere grounded, when the next part of the story happened. I didn't need to be in the lobby for it. The lobby would take care of itself. But I watched, afterward, through the small window that connected the kitchen to the back hallway, as Vivian crossed the lobby toward the front desk. She was not loud. That surprised me, or maybe it didn't. Maybe the loudness had always been something she performed for an audience, and when the audience disappeared, what was left underneath was quieter than she wanted anyone to know. She spoke to Diane. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the shape of the conversation, Vivian's posture tightening, her hands moving in small, sharp gestures, Diane standing steady behind the desk with the calm that had become her own over the past 2 weeks. Diane didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She listened, and when Vivian finished, she handed her a second document, a printed copy of the termination notice, with a note at the bottom in Claire's handwriting that read, "For your records." Vivian took it. She looked down at it for a long time. And then she turned and walked back across the lobby, and I watched her go, and I felt nothing. Not triumph. Not satisfied. Not even the quiet relief I had expected. Just a stillness. A sense of something settling into its correct place, the way a book settles onto a shelf after being held for too long. Marcus left the hotel that afternoon without speaking to anyone. Claire saw him in the parking area, loading a bag into the back of his car. He didn't look up when she passed. He didn't ask to see me again. He simply left the same way he had left everything else in his life that had become inconvenient. Quietly. Without a word. Without the dignity of an explanation. The difference, this time, was that his leaving didn't feel like an absence. It felt like an ending. The hotel settled into the evening the way it always did, slowly, gently, the lights dimming in the lobby, the kitchen winding down, the staff finishing their shifts and drifting out into the city. I stayed later than usual, not because there was anything left to do, but because I wanted to sit quietly for a while. To feel the space around me, the space I had built, the space I had defended, and to understand what it meant now that the thing I had been bracing for had come and gone. I sat in the lobby alone, in one of the deep chairs by the window, with a cup of tea that had gone cold. The city was dark outside. Ashford was silent. And I thought about the past 2 weeks, not the strategy, not the documents, not the legal steps or the staff meetings or the phone calls to Ruth. I thought about the quieter things. The moments that mattered more than the ones that made the story move. I thought about Lena, sitting in my office with her shoulders pulled inward, and the way they had straightened by the end of the week. I thought about Diane at the front desk, holding her ground with a calm that had not been there when she started. I thought about James behind the bar, pouring bourbon for people who didn't deserve his attention, and the way he had smiled that morning when I told him simply, without ceremony, that he had done a good job. I thought about Claire, who had carried the weight of this beside me without ever being asked to, and who had done it with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. And I thought about myself, not the version of myself who had signed that termination notice, not the version who had sat across from Marcus in my office and refused to negotiate. The other version. The one from 2 years ago, who had woken up one morning to find an empty account and a 4-line email, and who had sat alone in a much smaller room, trying to understand how someone could leave without ever really saying goodbye. That version of me would not have done what I did. She would have absorbed it. She would have made room for it, the way she made room for everything, quietly, accommodatingly, without demanding that anyone explain themselves. She would have let it go, not because she was at peace with it, but because she didn't yet understand that letting go and accepting less were not the same thing. I understand it now. Ruth called me the next morning to confirm that everything was in order, the forfeited deposit, the vendor contracts, the documentation. She told me, in her usual economical way, that if Marcus or Vivian chose to challenge the termination, we were in a strong position. Clean records. Clear violations. A process that had been followed at every step. They won't challenge it, I said. How do you know? Because challenging it would mean drawing attention to what Vivian did. And attention is the one thing they can't afford right now. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're right." She was right that I was right. And we both knew it. The story, as stories do, continued beyond the edges of what I have told you. Word spread not loudly, not all at once, but in the way that things spread in an industry where reputation is currency. A wedding was cancelled at the ASHFORD. A bride removed for conduct. The details were not shared publicly. I made sure of that, but the shape of what had happened became known, quietly, among the people who mattered. Other hotels noticed. Other owners. Other people who ran spaces where dignity was supposed to mean something. Ashford's reputation didn't just survive. It deepened. Not because of what I had done to Vivian Castillo, but because of what I had refused to let happen inside my walls. People understood, instinctively, that this was a place where the rules were real. Where the staff were protected. Where no one, no matter how loud, how connected, how entitled, could walk in and take something that wasn't theirs to take. Marcus Hale disappeared from my life the way he had the first time, completely, without ceremony, as though he had never been there at all. I heard, months later, through someone in the industry, that the wedding had been rescheduled at a different venue. A larger one. Louder. The kind of place where Vivian's behavior would probably go unnoticed, absorbed into the noise of everything else. I hoped, for their sake, that it did. But I didn't lose sleep over it. On a quiet evening in late November, I sat in my office after everyone had gone home, and I looked out at the city the way I had looked at it the night all of this began, with the same stillness, the same awareness of the space around me. Ashford was quiet. It was always quiet at this hour. And I sat with that quiet the way you sit with something you have earned, not through force, not through loudness, but through the slow, careful work of knowing exactly who you are and refusing, finally, to be anything less. I had not changed. That was the thing I understood most clearly, sitting there in the dark, with the city glowing softly beyond the glass. I had not become someone harder, or colder, or more ruthless. I had simply stopped making room for people who didn't deserve the space I was giving them. I had stopped explaining myself to people who had no intention of listening. I had stopped believing that silence was the same as peace. It wasn't. It never had been. Peace was this quiet room, this steady breath, this knowledge that the place I had built was exactly what I had always meant it to be. A place where the rules meant something. Where the people mattered. Where no one could walk in and take what wasn't theirs, no matter how quietly they tried. Justice didn't arrive loudly. It arrived because I stopped explaining. Thank you for reading. The pen touched the paper and I signed away the one thing that mattered most, the wedding that would never happen. I didn't hesitate. My hand was steady, the ink flowing dark and final across the cancellation clause, and in that moment I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months. I was not the villain of this story. I was simply the one who had finally stopped being the victim. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Elena Ward. I own the Ashford, a boutique luxury hotel nestled in the quieter end of the city, the kind of place where people come to disappear for a few days and leave feeling like a better version of themselves. 32 rooms. A rooftop garden. A restaurant that earned its reputation not through noise, but through silence, the kind of silence that happens when food is so good, people forget to speak. I built this place from a single lease, a brutal loan, and 3 years of sleeping on a cot in the back office. Every thread, every tile, every policy in this hotel is mine. And I know it the way a surgeon knows a body intimately, precisely, without room for error. If this is the kind of story that settles into you quietly, the kind that stays long after you stop listening, stay with me. I think you'll want to hear how all of it unraveled. I didn't always have this. There was a time when I was someone else's shadow, quieter, more accommodating, always adjusting myself to fit into someone else's frame. That version of me believed that if I was good enough, loyal enough, invisible enough, the people I trusted would meet me halfway. I was wrong. But that's not where this story begins. This story begins with a name on a booking form, and the way my stomach dropped the moment I saw it. His name was Marcus Hale. I hadn't heard it spoken out loud in almost 2 years, and I certainly hadn't expected to see it typed neatly into one of my reservation forms on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Marcus Hale, former CEO of Hale and Ashford Capital, former fiancé, former person I believed I would build a life with. He had walked out of mine with so little drama that it almost felt like a kindness. No arguments. No accusations. He simply stopped showing up, stopped returning calls, and one morning I woke up to find the joint account emptied and a short email that read, "I think we both know this wasn't working." That was it. No explanation. No apology. Just a door closing so quietly you almost miss the sound. I read the reservation form 3 times. The booking was for a wedding, a full-scale, 5-day celebration at the Ashford. The bride was someone named Vivian Castillo. I didn't recognize the name, but the groom's name was listed as a secondary contact, and it was unmistakable, Marcus Hale. The deposit had already been wired. The contract had been drafted by my operations manager, Claire, who had no reason to flag it. Everything was standard. Everything was clean. And everything made my hands go cold. I sat at my desk for a long time after that, reading the form again and again, not because I didn't understand it, but because I was waiting for something inside me to react the way I expected it to. I was waiting for anger, or grief, or the sharp familiar sting of being reminded of what I'd lost. But what came instead was something quieter. Something almost clinical. I looked at the name and I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt something that was adjacent to nothing. A recognition. A shift. Like watching a chess piece move on a board and understanding, before anyone else in the room, exactly where the game was going. I approved the booking that afternoon. Claire walked me through the details in her usual efficient way, the guest count, the dietary requirements, the timeline for setup. She didn't notice anything unusual in my demeanor, and I didn't offer any. I signed off on every line item with the same steady hand I use for every contract, and I filed the paperwork without a second glance. Claire left the office, and I sat alone with the quiet understanding that I had just let something into my house that I would need to be very, very careful about. The first week passed without incident. The wedding was scheduled for the following month, so there was time to prepare, time to observe, time to decide how I wanted to handle this. I told myself I was being rational. I told myself that the ASHFORD was a business, Marcus was a paying guest, and my personal history with him was exactly that personal. It had no place in the way I ran this hotel. I believed that. I wanted to believe it. And for a while, it was almost true. It was Claire who first mentioned Vivian Castillo by name in conversation, and it was so casual that I almost didn't register it. We were reviewing the event timeline in the back office, the small, windowless room where I do most of my thinking, and Claire said, "Vivian came in yesterday to check on the floral arrangements. She was very particular." I looked up. Particularly how? Claire hesitated. That hesitation told me more than her words would have. Claire had worked with me for 4 years. She was unflappable. She managed staff disputes, vendor emergencies, and once a minor kitchen fire without raising her voice. So when she hesitated, I paid attention. "She told the florist to scrap the entire arrangement," Claire said carefully. Said it looked suburban. Then she asked me directly if the hotel had a policy on brides being able to approve all vendor selections personally. What did you tell her? I told her the truth. That vendor selections are managed through our events team and that changes go through a formal request process. And? Claire gave me a look, the kind of look that said you already know. She laughed. Not rudely. Just, like the question was funny. Like the idea of a process was something she found amusing. I nodded slowly, and Claire left the room. I sat with that information the way you sit with a weather report for a storm that hasn't arrived yet. I noted it. I filed it. And I waited. The second time I encountered Vivian Castillo, it was not by accident. I had decided, quietly and without telling anyone, to be present at the hotel more often during the wedding preparation phase. Not visibly, I wasn't going to stand in the lobby watching. But I would be nearby. I would be aware. I would let my instincts do the work they had been trained to do over years of running a business that demanded precision. And on a Wednesday afternoon, while I was reviewing invoices in the small office adjacent to the front desk, Vivian walked in. She was tall. Polished. The kind of woman who wore confidence the way other people wore jewelry, openly, deliberately, so that no one could miss it. She was wearing something expensive and understated, and her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she had spent considerable time making it look effortless. She walked up to the front desk, didn't wait for the attendant to acknowledge her, and spoke. "I need the suite upgraded," she said. Not asked. Said. The attendant, a young woman named Diane, who had been with the hotel for 6 months and was quiet and competent, looked up and smiled. "Of course. Let me check availability and I can." "I don't need you to check," Vivian said. "I need it done. Marcus is arriving tomorrow and I want the honeymoon suite ready by noon." Diane glanced at me through the open office door. She didn't need to say anything. I stood up, walked out, and smiled at Vivian with the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly where you stand in a room. "Miss Castillo," I said. "Welcome back. I'm Elena Ward. I own the ASHFORD." Suite upgrades are something we handle on a case-by-case basis, and I'd be happy to look into availability for you personally. But I do need to follow our standard process. It usually takes about 24 hours. Vivian looked at me. Not unkindly, exactly. But with the kind of assessment that people make when they're deciding whether someone is useful or an obstacle. 24 hours, she repeated. Yes. She smiled a small, controlled smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm sure you can do better than that, she said, and walked away. I watched her go, and something settled into place inside me, not anger, not yet, but a quiet, sharp awareness. Here it is. If this story touched something inside you, something you maybe haven't said out loud yet, I want you to know, you're not alone in that. So many of us have been in that quiet place, where we kept making space for people who never made space for us. If that's ever been you, I hope this story reminded you of something important. The moment you stop explaining yourself to people who were never going to listen, that's not weakness. That's the beginning of everything. If you have a story like this, yours, someone you know, I'd love to hear it in the comments. No judgment here, just a safe space. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need it tonight. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because every story on this channel carries a lesson worth holding on to. Thank you genuinely for staying until the very end. That means more than you know.